Native American civilizations. Before the steel rails, the roaring engines, and the waving flags of a newly formed nation, there was a land. Vast, timeless, silent except for the songs of birds, the whispers of the wind through ancient trees, and the footfalls of those who had lived here long before the name America was ever spoken. This was a land that stretched from the icy coasts of the north to the sun-baked deserts of the south, from the rocky cliffs of the Pacific to the wide, grassy plains that seemed to go on forever. And on this land, for thousands of years, lived a vast web of cultures, what we now call Native American civilizations. These civilizations were as diverse and unique as the landscapes they lived on. There were the Iroquois of the northeastern woodlands, who built longhouses that sheltered families through long, snowy winters. The Iroquois Confederacy was not just a tribal alliance, it was a complex and peaceful political system, something so influential that it would later inspire parts of the U.S. Constitution. Further south, among the Mississippi River valleys, stood earthen pyramids that rivaled those of Egypt, not in stone, but in sacred soil. This was Cahokia, a city, a metropolis. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people. There were ceremonial plazas, observatories aligned with the stars, and bustling markets filled with traders from distant lands. It was a society organized with remarkable precision. Then, in the American Southwest, there were the ancestral Puebloans. You might know them as the Anasazi. These people carved their homes directly into the cliffs. If you visit Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon today, you'll see the remains. Rooms stacked like bricks against stone, as if nature and humanity had formed a single creation. They built kivas, round, subterranean chambers used for ceremonies. They tracked the movements of the sun and the moon, and left behind painted symbols and carvings that whisper stories to those who stop and look. Along the Pacific coast, from California to Alaska, lived tribes like the Chumash and the Tlingit. They were masters of the sea. Their canoes, carved from single giant redwood trees, glided across ocean waves with practiced grace. They fished, traded, and told stories passed down from generation to generation. Stories of salmon spirits, towering forests, and stars that watched over them at night. In the Great Plains, before the arrival of horses, people like the Lakota and the Pawnee followed the bison. Every part of the buffalo was used, its hide for homes, its bones for tools, its meat for nourishment. Their societies were mobile, tightly knit, and deeply spiritual. The rhythm of their life was in harmony with the beat of the earth. Farther south still, in what is now the American Southeast, were the Mississippians, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and others. They had structured towns, with central plazas and council houses. They farmed corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters. Their stories were rich with myth and metaphor. They believed the world was balanced between opposites, light and dark, sky and earth, summer and winter. Keeping that balance was essential. Across the Arctic North were the Inuit and the Aleut. In a world of snow and silence, they built homes from ice and hunted seal and whale. Their clothes were crafted to survive in a place where even the breath of the wind could take life. Yet even there was joy, songs sung under the northern lights, stories shared beside oil lamps, and laughter echoing across frozen seas. These civilizations were not frozen in time. They changed, traded, fought, and collaborated. They had languages, hundreds of them, spiritual beliefs tied to animals, seasons, and stars, systems of governance, justice, and education. They were not simply survivors of the wild. They were stewards of the land, caretakers of ancient knowledge, and architects of a world that many never learned to see. And then, change came. Ships on the horizon, strange flags and unfamiliar languages. With them came new tools, yes, but also disease, displacement, and conflict. The civilizations that had thrived for millennia would face trials unimaginable. But this part of the story comes later. Tonight, we rest not in the roar of change but in the calm before. A quiet evening on the plains. A fire flickering in the forest. A child drifting to sleep beneath the stars, listening to their elders speak of spirits, ancestors, and sacred paths that no longer lie on maps. This was the beginning of what would become the United States, not with cities and steel, but with people and places, harmony and wisdom. A land already full of life before anyone tried to build it. So close your eyes now, and imagine the soft crunch of moccasins on pine needles, the low hum of a drum echoing in the distance, the hush of wind moving across tall grasses, and know that this, too, is America. Sacred landscapes and tribal territories. Long before lines were drawn on maps, before treaties were signed and borders enforced, the land was not divided, but deeply known. It was not owned, but honored. It was sacred. It was alive. To the many Native American nations, the land was never merely ground beneath their feet. It was memory, it was spirit, it was teacher. Every valley, river, mountain, and plain had meaning. Every stone could hold a story. Every tree could whisper a lesson. This connection between people and place created an invisible map, one not found in books, but passed down in stories, ceremonies, and sacred rites. Let's begin with the concept of sacred landscapes. In the southwestern deserts, the Dine, the Navajo, speak of their 4 sacred mountains: Mount Blanca, Mount Taylor, Mount Hesperus, and the San Francisco Peaks. These mountains don't just mark a homeland, they define a spiritual universe. Within their bounds lies HZH, the harmony of life. To live well, to live in balance, is to live within these sacred borders. The mountains are protectors, ancestors, and prayers turned to stone. Farther east, the Lakota people honor the Black Hills, or Paha Sapa. These rounded hills of pine and granite rise from the prairie like the bones of the earth. The Lakota say this is the center of the world, where the spirits dwell and creation began. The hills are more than just terrain. They are family. They are sacred not only in myth, but in ceremony and everyday life. And the Hopi? They dwell on mesas that stretch into the sky like giant fingers of stone. For the Hopi, the mesas are not just homes. They are portals between the earthly and the divine. Paths traced in the dust are not just trails. They are the footprints of ancestors, the roots of emergence from previous worlds. This sense of sacred geography was not just limited to specific landmarks. All of the land had meaning. There were vision quest sites tucked into quiet forests. Waterfalls where spirits were known to speak. Trees wrapped in prayer ties. Caves painted with symbols that pointed the way through seasons, life stages, and dreams. Now consider tribal territories. These were not like modern states or rigid national borders. They were fluid, respected, known. The Comanche moved with the buffalo across the plains, from what is now Texas into Oklahoma and beyond. Their land was not fenced, it was followed. They knew every bend in the river, every place where game would rest. The land was memorized like a song. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois League, had its territory in the rich woodlands of present-day New York and Ontario. Their longhouses were set within forests that they tended, not tamed. Paths linked their villages like threads in a great, green fabric. To walk these paths was to walk through generations of knowledge. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit, Haida, and Coast Salish peoples lived in villages strung along the coastal inlets. Their territories were marked by totem poles, by stories carved in cedar and set beside the tides. These territories weren't static. They were negotiated through alliances, intermarriage, and ceremonies of potlatch. Territory wasn't just about space. It was about relationships. And in the southeast, the Cherokee lived in towns along rivers with names that still echo through the region: Chattahoochee, Tuckasegee, Okonalifte. These weren't just settlements. They were living centers of trade, story, and spirit. The river was not a boundary, it was a lifeline. It connected communities and nourished the land. Among many native nations, land use was guided by seasonal cycles. A place might be for hunting in the fall, gathering in the spring, or ceremony in the summer. Families would move, not because they were lost, but because they were following the rhythm of the earth. The territory wasn't abandoned. It was being respected, allowed to rest and renew. Land was also deeply tied to oral tradition. A child growing up in a Cherokee village might learn not just how to walk the land, but how to listen to it. They'd be told, "That hill? That's where the thunder beings rest. Don't go there in a storm. Or, this river bend? That's where the fish wait to see if you're patient enough to catch them. These were more than stories. They were instructions. Maps of meaning. Even the stars above were part of the land. In the high desert, a Navajo elder might trace constellations in the sky and match them to landmarks below. Mountains, mesas, shadows. To move across the land was to read a sacred text, written not in letters but in stones, slopes, and stars. And yet, despite all this depth and reverence, many early European settlers and mapmakers saw the land as empty, as open, as uncivilized. They drew lines where there were none. They carved borders where communities had moved for generations. They did not see the sacred. They did not hear the songs in the wind. But that knowledge of sacred landscapes and tribal territories was not erased. It was carried forward by elders who whispered it to sleeping children, by prayers spoken on mountaintops and by the rivers, by ceremonies that marked the solstice, the harvest, and the memory of all that came before. Today, if you walk quietly through these lands, you might still feel it. The warmth in the stones, the hush in the trees, the old stories hanging in the air. And in that stillness, you may come to know, this land was never empty. It was always full. Full of meaning. Full of memory. Full of sacred breath. So as you close your eyes tonight, picture not the map of the United States as it is drawn today, but a different kind of map. One made of mountain spirits, dancing fires, river songs, and sacred echoes. Let the land speak to you, not with words, but with wonder. Early trade networks and cultural exchange. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a vast, sprawling continent, not divided by highways or fences, but gently linked by winding rivers, woodland trails, mountain passes, and ocean currents. This was North America before the colonists arrived. And across this land, long before the modern United States began to take shape, trade was already flourishing. It wasn't trade in the loud, bustling way we might picture today. No flashing neon signs. No digital transactions. It was quieter, gentler. A beaded belt exchanged with a story. A bundle of herbs given in thanks. A piece of obsidian passed from hand to hand, from tribe to tribe, carrying with it not just value, but memory. These early trade networks were the lifelines of ancient America, invisible threads that tied together people, places, and cultures across hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles. From the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains, from the Arctic tundra to the desert southwest, indigenous communities were connected in rich, intricate ways. Let's begin in the heart of the continent, what we now call the Mississippi River Valley. Here lay a great civilization known as Cahokia. By 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people. Towering mounds rose above the plains, some as tall as pyramids. It was a place of ceremony, of governance, and of commerce. Cahokia was a hub, a kind of ancient metropolis, and goods flowed in from far and wide. Copper from the Great Lakes, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from the Rocky West. These weren't just resources. They were part of a grand cultural exchange. When a piece of shell arrived at Cahokia, it didn't just bring beauty. It brought the story of the ocean, the salt winds, the journey through forests and rivers. Farther south, in what is now Arizona and New Mexico, the ancestral Puebloans, often known as the Anasazi, built intricate cliff dwellings and ceremonial centers. One of their great cities was Chaco Canyon, a place of mystery and geometry aligned with the stars. Chaco wasn't isolated. It was a beacon. Roads, straight and purposeful, stretched from Chaco to other villages, outposts, and far-off lands. Turquoise from the southwest was traded for macaw feathers and cacao beans from Mesoamerica. Think about that for a moment. Vivid feathers from tropical birds, traveling thousands of miles, carried with care and reverence. Along the Pacific coast, the peoples of the Northwest, like the Tlingit and the Haida, crafted canoes from towering cedar trees and paddled the sea routes. They traded dried fish, carved totems, woven blankets. Trade wasn't merely economic, it was ceremonial, social. Potlatches, elaborate feasts of giving, were as much about status and generosity as they were about exchange. To the east, the Wampanoag, the Lenape, the Powhatan, peoples of the coastal woodlands, engaged in extensive trade along rivers and trails. They bartered in wampum, beautifully crafted beads made from shells. But wampum wasn't just currency, it was meaning made visible. Wampum belts told stories. They marked agreements. They held memory, much like books might do in later centuries. And across the Great Plains, even the nomadic tribes had their networks. The Comanche and the Lakota, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, they followed the great herds, but they didn't live in isolation. They traded horses, hides, and buffalo meat. They shared songs, dances, and stories. The trade routes were as much cultural highways as they were material ones. You see, when we speak of early trade networks, we are not merely speaking of goods. We are speaking of a great dance, a quiet, rhythmic movement of ideas, beliefs, languages, and lives. When obsidian traveled from the Cascades to the plains, it carried more than sharp edges. It carried the echo of volcanoes. When shells made their way from Florida to Ohio, they brought not just beauty, but the sound of waves. And through this exchange came understanding. A pottery style from one region would show up hundreds of miles away, its patterns mixed with new symbols. A religious belief from the mountains would mingle with river legends. Cultures blended not through conquest, but through curiosity. These trade routes were also pathways of diplomacy. Tribes would gather at certain neutral grounds, lush valleys, meeting places by great rivers. Here they would smoke pipes, share food, exchange daughters in marriage. These gatherings were not just markets. They were bonds of peace. They were reminders that even in the vastness of the land, people were never alone. Imagine the sound of such a meeting, the crackle of a fire, the murmur of unfamiliar languages, the soft jingle of beadwork, the hush as stories passed from elder to elder. These were moments of trust. Moments where a stone from a distant quarry could hold more meaning than gold. Even after European contact began, many of these networks remained in place, at least for a while. Native traders adapted, using metal tools and cloth in place of older goods. But still, the spirit of exchange, the slow, sacred sharing, lingered. Today, archaeologists still find traces of these networks. A piece of turquoise in a burial mound far from its source. A carving of a macaw in a desert cave. Evidence of chocolate consumption in the southwest, long before the Spanish ever arrived. These artifacts are not just relics. They are whispers of a forgotten highway. A gentle, winding web that once held a continent together. So as you drift off to sleep, picture this. A path stretching across the forest floor, barely visible but well-trodden. A trader wrapped in furs, walking patiently under starlight. A canoe sliding silently through morning mist. A bundle of goods exchanged with a smile. And far away, someone else lighting a fire, knowing that today, someone will come bearing stories, songs, and something sacred. These were the earliest threads in the great tapestry that would one day become the United States, not drawn with ink or enforced with armies, but woven gently by generations of hands across thousands of years. The arrival of Norse explorers. Before the famed ships of Columbus ever set sail across the Atlantic, before the dreams of a new world stirred in European courts, another group of daring seafarers had already touched the edges of North America. They came not with grand fanfare or imperial mandates, but quietly, almost like a whisper carried by the northern winds. These were the Norse explorers, often called the Vikings. Let us drift back, gently, to a time around the year 1000 AD. The icy winds of the North Atlantic howl softly across dark waters, where dragon-headed ships glide over swelling waves. These are longships, sturdy, elegant vessels carved by the Norse, designed for speed and resilience. On board are men wrapped in furs, their beards damp with sea spray, their minds filled with tales of distant shores and strange lands. Their leader, a man known as Leif Erikson, was the son of Eric the Red, the fierce and ambitious Norseman who founded the first settlements in Greenland. Leif had heard rumors from other sailors, whispers of a green, wooded land to the west. Curious and bold, he set out from Greenland in search of this place, guided not by compasses or maps, but by memory, sun, stars, and stories. After weeks at sea, Leif and his crew glimpsed a new coast, rugged, forested, and rich with promise. They had arrived in what we now believe was Newfoundland, Canada, in a place they named Vinland, the land of wild grapes. Now, imagine the Norse stepping onto this land, boots crunching over frosted grass, breaths misting in the cold morning air. The forests are dense and dark, filled with unfamiliar sounds. The rivers run clear, teeming with salmon. The air smells of pine and possibility. They build shelters, perhaps using turf and timber. Fires flicker. Meals are shared. The night is long, and stars will slowly overhead. Vinland was not empty. The Norse would have encountered indigenous peoples, possibly ancestors of the Beothuk or other First Nations. These meetings were tense and sometimes hostile. The Norse called them Skraelings, though we know little of how these early interactions truly unfolded. There was likely a mixture of awe, caution, curiosity, and fear. Despite the land's richness, the Norse settlements didn't last long. Harsh winters, conflict with local inhabitants, and the distance from Greenland made sustaining a colony difficult. Within a few years, the Norse had returned to Greenland and later to Iceland. Vinland faded from their daily lives, becoming more of a legend than a destination. Still, the memory of it remained. The Norse sagas, epic tales passed down through generations, kept the story alive. In the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, we read of Leif's journey, of encounters with the Skraelings, of battles and trade, and of the strange, wild beauty of Vinland. And though the Norse never founded a lasting colony in North America, their arrival matters. It matters because it changes the shape of the story. It reminds us that history is not always a straight line. That before the age of exploration officially began, brave souls were already setting sail into the unknown. Centuries would pass before Europe turned its gaze westward again. But deep in the icy north, the story of Vinland lingered, half forgotten, half believed. It would take archaeologists nearly 1,000 years to confirm that the Norse had indeed landed in North America. In the 1960s, at a site called Elance Auxiliary Meadows in Newfoundland, researchers uncovered the remains of Norse buildings, timber frames, turf walls, iron nails, and tools, all unmistakably Scandinavian. It was proof, quiet, unassuming proof that the Norse had been there. That Leif's journey was not just a story, but a memory carved into the earth itself. Now, let yourself drift further into that memory. Picture the soft crunch of snow underfoot, the distant crack of an axe on wood, the murmur of Norse voices by firelight, the low hum of a sea wind against the walls of a sod house. A world both wild and beautiful, where myth met geography. In that sleepy corner of Newfoundland, where the trees sway gently and the sea breathes against the shore, you can still feel it, that ancient silence. A kind of reverent hush, as if the land itself remembers the boots that once touched its soil, the ships that sailed away before dawn, the voices that whispered stories to the stars. And so, the Norse explorers become the earliest known Europeans to touch the American continent. Not conquerors, not settlers, but wanderers, dreamers, men carried not by maps or riches, but by curiosity and the courage to follow it. Their journey didn't alter the course of history immediately, but it left a mark, a faint echo, a page in the long book of how the United States would one day be built. As you rest now, perhaps you can hear that echo, the creak of a wooden mast, the splash of an oar in cold, dark water, the call of a seabird overhead, and somewhere far, far away, the flicker of a fire in Vinland, where strangers once came ashore and wondered what stories the land might tell. Colonial exploration and the age of discovery. Close your eyes and imagine the world as it once was, vast, mysterious, and full of shadows at the edges of every map. For centuries, Europe had gazed eastward towards spice-laden lands, silken roads, and the golden allure of Asia. But then, slowly, the gaze shifted westward, toward the unknown, toward the ocean's horizon. This shift brought about a new era, an era we call the Age of Discovery. It was a time of sails catching the wind like silent wings. A time when wooden ships groaned softly as they cut across dark oceans under star-strewn skies. It was not a hurried time, but a patient, wandering one. Every journey was uncertain, and every landfall could mean wonder or peril. This was the world into which explorers like Christopher Columbus, John Cabot, and Amerigo Vespucci sailed. Let's begin with Christopher Columbus, whose name, for many, marks the beginning of American exploration. In 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain, not to discover a new world, but to find a new path to the East Indies. What he found instead were the islands of the Caribbean. He believed he had reached Asia, not realizing he had touched upon a continent largely unknown to Europe. He never set foot on the mainland that would become the United States, but his voyage opened the way for countless others. Next came John Cabot, sailing under the English flag. In 1497, he reached the shores of what may have been Newfoundland or possibly parts of the North American coast. Like Columbus, he believed he had found Asia. But the land he touched would become the foundation for future English claims in North America. As the years passed, more ships came. Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator, sailed along the South American coast and suggested that these lands were not Asia at all, but a new world. It was from his name that the term America would eventually be drawn. And slowly, a clearer picture began to form in the minds of European scholars. A landmass across the ocean, full of untapped riches and new possibilities. With this realization, exploration turned into ambition. France, Spain, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands all sent expeditions. Some sought gold, others sought roots. Still others sought souls to convert. And some simply sought glory. They mapped coastlines, charted rivers, and met with the many indigenous nations already living in harmony with the land. Let's pause and imagine one such voyage. A wooden ship bobbing on the waves. Its deck creaking beneath the footsteps of sailors. The sails full. The sun dipping low into a golden sea. Below, in the captain's quarters, maps lie open. Rough sketches of coasts drawn with ink and uncertainty. There are no satellite images, no accurate charts. Just guesses. Hopes. Dreams. One such explorer was Jacques Cartier, sailing for France. In the 1530s, he explored parts of Canada and navigated the mighty St. Lawrence River. He met indigenous peoples who had lived on that land for generations and recorded his interactions with them. Some peaceful, some strained. Another, Henry Hudson, explored the river that would bear his name in what is now New York. His search for a northwest passage, an elusive water route to Asia, would end in mystery, as his crew mutinied and set him adrift in the cold, silent waters of the north. Back then, every shoreline was a question. Every river, a potential highway. Every forest, a realm of imagination and myth. And as explorers ventured farther inland, they began to report back tales of vast plains, towering mountains, and bountiful lands. But this age was not without its shadows. For with exploration came exploitation. As Europeans claimed lands, they often overlooked the fact that these lands were already home to millions of indigenous people. Cultures that had thrived for thousands of years were soon disrupted by disease, by violence, by displacement. The Age of Discovery, for all its romance and wonder, also brought with it the seeds of deep and lasting sorrow. Still, in the quiet of history, the ships kept coming. Silent armadas crossing the Atlantic. One after another. Their sails white against the sky. Their hulls heavy with supplies, and heavier still with hopes. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine being on one of those ships. The wooden boards beneath your back. The stars above, wheeling slowly. The hush of the sea. The occasional cry of a seabird. The gentle rocking of the waves, like the earth itself breathing softly. A dream of land just over the horizon. A land untouched, unseen. A land waiting to be found, or perhaps remembered. In time, these early journeys would become stories, and the stories would become history. A patchwork of discovery and ambition, kindness and cruelty, courage and consequence. These were the first threads in the great fabric of America's creation. And so, the Age of Discovery planted its quiet roots. not with blaring trumpets or grand declarations, but with the quiet splash of an oar in unknown waters. The rustle of parchment as a map was unrolled. The soft prayers of sailors dreaming of home. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to change everything. The Spanish influence and conquistadors. Let us gently drift now into a time when the Spanish Empire cast its long shadow across the New World. This was not just a tale of flags planted and riches seized. It was a moment in history when the sound of foreign tongues echoed across forests, deserts, and mountain ranges that had never heard them before. And with these echoes came change, deep and lasting. The Spanish were among the earliest and most aggressive European powers to explore, claim, and settle parts of the Americas. Their presence would profoundly shape the cultural, linguistic, and architectural landscape of many future regions of the United States. But to understand how, we must first sail alongside those who brought Spain's influence across the Atlantic, those men known as conquistadors. The word conquistador means conqueror, and it is a word soaked in both awe and sorrow. These were men like Hernán Cortés, who would overthrow the Aztec Empire, and Francisco Pizarro, who would bring down the Inca. They were adventurers and soldiers, driven by dreams of gold and glory, and by a fierce belief in their divine right to rule. Their arrival was thunderous. Clad in armor that gleamed beneath the sun, they rode horses, animals unknown to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They carried steel weapons and firearms, unfamiliar tools of war. And with them, often unintentionally, came something invisible but devastating: disease. Illnesses like smallpox would spread rapidly among native populations, weakening societies even before battles began. But the Spanish did not only explore the southern parts of the continent. Their reach extended far north, deep into what is now the United States. In 1513, the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de León landed in Florida. He named it La Florida, the flowery land, enchanted by its lush vegetation and springtime blooms. He searched for a mythical fountain of youth, but what he found was something even more enduring, a place that Spain would claim for centuries. In 1540, Francisco Bosques de Coronado led a grand expedition from Mexico northward into the American Southwest. He and his men were in search of the fabled 7 cities of gold, cities whispered about in legend, glittering with unimaginable wealth. They crossed into lands now called Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and even Kansas. Though they found no golden cities, they did chart lands and encounter cultures that had existed peacefully for generations. The Spanish built missions, places of worship and community that would also serve as footholds of empire. These missions, strung like beads along the Californian coast and into the Southwest, were more than just churches. They were centers of agriculture, education, and conversion, aimed at bringing indigenous people into the fold of Spanish Catholic life. Imagine now one such mission: the soft sound of bells chiming in the early morning light, the scent of bread baking in an adobe oven, rows of crops swaying in the breeze, indigenous children learning Spanish prayers, the gentle strumming of a guitar as hymns echo softly through stone walls. It's peaceful, but beneath the surface, it is also complex. For every act of kindness, there was often pressure, displacement, and cultural erasure. The history of these missions is both tranquil and tragic. As you breathe in, feel the calm of those silent desert mornings. Picture the cool shade under clay-tiled roofs. Feel the quiet pride of the craftsmen who shaped red clay bricks with their bare hands. The Spanish brought their architecture, their language, their religion, and their way of life, and many of these influences are still felt today in places like California, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. Spanish rule was administered through vast land grants, called encomiendas, which gave settlers control over indigenous labor and tribute. This system exploited many native peoples and disrupted traditional ways of life. Over time, some communities resisted, and tensions occasionally flared into open conflict. Yet, even amid the shadows, there was adaptation and exchange. Spanish settlers learned from indigenous techniques, how to irrigate the land, how to survive the desert. And indigenous people sometimes found ways to blend their traditions with Catholic practices, creating something new and unique. As the Spanish crown grew more powerful, Large fortresses and presidios were established to protect these new frontiers. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, became the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the United States. Its narrow streets and stone walls still whisper stories of early settlers, soldiers, and the sea. By the early 1600s, the Spanish influence stretched across the Gulf Coast, the Southwest, and even into parts of the Midwest. Though other European powers would later stake their claims, Spain's early presence laid down deep cultural roots. Take a moment now, as you drift toward rest, to reflect on the soft golden glow of a setting sun over the desert. Hear the distant bells of an old mission. Imagine the mingling scents of sagebrush and incense. This was a land touched by many hands, and the Spanish influence, though at times harsh, added colors and shapes that would forever be part of the American mosaic. In time, the Spanish would clash with the French, the British, and even rebellious settlers. But in this moment, in this chapter of history, they stood alone under the blazing sun, planting their language, their customs, and their faith into the soil of the New World. The conquistadors have long since passed into memory, and their armored horses ride only in the pages of history books. But their footprints remain, in city names, in old churches, and in the soft cadence of Spanish words spoken on American streets. And as the stars begin to appear overhead, we move on, quietly, to the next chapter of how the United States was built. The lost colony of Roanoke. Let us now drift toward a mystery, one that has baffled historians for centuries, whispered through the oaks and pines of the North Carolina coast. The tale of the lost colony of Roanoke is not only one of early ambition but of silence, of questions left unanswered, and of people who vanished without a trace. It is a haunting lullaby in the cradle of early American history. Close your eyes and imagine the late 16th century. England was eager to claim its place among the great empires of Europe. Inspired by tales of riches and expansion, Sir Walter Raleigh, under a charter from Queen Elizabeth I, sought to establish a permanent English presence in the New World. In 1585, Raleigh's first group of settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. This location was chosen for its strategic value, a safe harbor nestled between the mainland and the vast Atlantic. But the colony, as peaceful as the waves that lapped its shores, was soon challenged by harsh conditions, difficult relationships with local indigenous tribes, and a severe lack of supplies. These early settlers struggled, and after just a year, they abandoned the island, returning to England. Yet the dream had not faded. In 1587, a second, more hopeful expedition was organized, this time with families, women, and children among the colonists. Led by John White, this group sought not just to explore, but to truly build a new home in this distant land. Among them was White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who would give birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. It was a tender symbol of hope, a quiet sign that this time, perhaps, the colony might succeed. But soon after the settlers arrived, John White made the difficult decision to return to England for more supplies. He had planned to return quickly, but fate intervened. England was at war with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth commandeered nearly every available ship to defend the homeland. It would be 3 long years before White could make his way back to Roanoke. When he finally arrived in 1590, the island met him with stillness. There was no laughter from children, no smoke rising from chimneys, no footprints in the sand. The colony was deserted. There was no sign of struggle. No bodies. No graves. No blood. Only a single word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. It was a name of a nearby island and the indigenous people who lived there. Had the colonists gone there to seek help? Had they been taken in? Or had something else entirely occurred? John White searched desperately, but a storm and dwindling resources forced his ship to turn back. He would never see his family again, and the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke would pass into legend. Now, as you breathe in and let go of the day, picture that quiet island. The wind moving through trees untouched for centuries. The soft crash of waves. The remains of earthen walls, overgrown by ivy and moss. Somewhere in that silence, the whispers of the past linger. Many theories have emerged over the years. Some believe the colonists were absorbed into the Croatoan tribe, blending cultures and traditions. Others suggest they may have tried to sail back to England themselves, only to be lost at sea. Still others imagine darker tales, attacks, famine, or illness. But no definitive evidence has ever surfaced. This unresolved ending has kept Roanoke in the imagination of writers, dreamers, and historians alike. It is a question without an answer, a door without a key. And yet, this strange chapter tells us much about the challenges of building a new world. The early colonies were fragile. They depended on supplies from across an ocean, on relationships with local tribes, and on the unpredictable rhythms of weather, war, and will. Roanoke was not a failure in the truest sense. It was a beginning, an attempt that paved the way for future efforts, like the founding of Jamestown and Plymouth. In the quiet vanishing of these early settlers, there remains a powerful testament to the courage of those who dared to dream, even when the outcome was unknown. Picture now a lantern swinging in the dark, a mother holding her child close, a man carving a word into a wooden post, hoping someone, someday, would understand. These are not just figures of history. They are reminders of how fragile and hopeful the roots of America truly were. Tonight, as you settle further into stillness, let the gentle mystery of Roanoke lull you. Let the unanswered questions be like stars, silent, steady, and softly glowing in the sky of the past. The colony is lost, but not forgotten. The Mayflower Voyage. Let your mind begin to wander back to the cool autumn of 1620. The sea is quiet now. The stars glimmer gently above, and the wind whispers low across the Atlantic Ocean. We find ourselves aboard a ship, creaking gently as it sways through the waters. This ship is not grand or swift, but it is brave. Its name is the Mayflower, and within its wooden belly rests a dream. The Mayflower was a merchant vessel, about 100 feet long, with 3 masts and a crew of about 30 men. But this voyage was unlike any it had ever undertaken. It carried not only passengers and supplies, but hope, fear, and the longing for a life unshackled from persecution. Aboard were 102 souls, men, women, and children, leaving behind all they had known in England and Holland, stepping toward the unknown in search of religious freedom. The passengers, later known as the Pilgrims, were part of a separatist group. They believed the Church of England was too entangled with politics and ceremony. They had faced fines, imprisonment, and exile for their beliefs. So they made a choice, one that was bold and irreversible. They would sail west to the New World to build a society where they could worship freely. On September 6, 1620, the Mayflower left Plymouth, England. The journey was long and unforgiving. The Atlantic in autumn is restless, and the ship was battered by storms. Imagine the wooden hull creaking with every wave. The passengers below deck, cramped, seasick, with little fresh air, struggled with the damp and the dark. There were no comforts. No beds as we know them, no warm meals, and no certainty of what lay ahead. Each day blurred into the next, wet clothes, rocking floors, the scent of salt and sickness. But they held on to their faith. They read scripture by candlelight. They prayed. They waited. For 66 days, they braved the sea. And then, on November 9th, they spotted land. But it wasn't Virginia, where they had been aiming. Strong winds and navigational errors had taken them farther north. They had arrived off the coast of what we now call Cape Cod, Massachusetts. They dropped anchor in the cold morning mist, and a great silence fell. Before stepping ashore, they faced a new challenge. They were outside the bounds of their official charter. There was no clear law here, no governance. To prevent disorder and unite their purpose, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, a short, solemn agreement to form a civil body politic and follow laws created for the good of the colony. It was signed by 41 men aboard the ship. With quills and ink, they created a foundation of self-government, one that would echo through American history. Imagine now the sound of those pens scratching on paper, the quiet resolve in each signature, the moment frozen in time, when people who had never ruled before now claimed the right to govern themselves. Stepping onto the shore was no triumphant arrival. The land was unfamiliar and wintry. Food was scarce. There were no homes, No help, only wilderness. The first winter was harsh. Nearly half of the colonists would not survive. They faced starvation, disease, and the icy bite of a New England winter with little shelter. And yet, something remarkable happened. As the snows melted and spring arrived, the surviving pilgrims met the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Squanto, who had learned English during his own tragic journey across the Atlantic. With his help, the pilgrims learned how to plant corn, where to fish, and how to live in harmony with the land. In the fall of 1621, after a successful harvest, the pilgrims and the Wampanoag shared a 3-day feast, what many today remember as the first Thanksgiving. It was a moment of peace, of gratitude, of shared humanity in a place where survival had once seemed so distant. But let's return now to that ship, rocking gently on the ocean, far from any future holiday. Picture the soft glow of lanterns in the captain's quarters, the murmur of prayers below deck, the salty breeze brushing across the weathered wood. The Mayflower was more than a vessel. It was a cradle of belief, a symbol of quiet courage. The voyage was not just a journey across the sea, but across time, carrying an idea of liberty, planted in fragile soil, watered by sacrifice. And though the colony would grow and change in ways the pilgrims could not have imagined, their compact, their hardships, and their faith formed a part of the American spirit. As you drift now into sleep, imagine those silent waves, rolling under the Mayflower. The stars still shine above as they did then, and the whispers of those early travelers still echo in the sea breeze. They were dreamers, after all, ordinary people who sought a life shaped by their conscience. Close your eyes and rest with them now. The ocean is calm. The journey is long. And the dream, though distant, is beginning. Establishing Plymouth Colony. Now that the Mayflower has found its place in the harbor and the weary passengers have taken their first cautious steps onto the cold New England soil, let us step gently alongside them as they begin a new chapter, one of labor, faith, and fragile hope. This is the story of how they began to build Plymouth Colony. It is December of 1620. The shoreline is stark, windswept, and gray. Trees stretch upward like silent sentinels, and the ground is hard with frost. The pilgrims, weakened by the sea voyage, set to work almost immediately. They must build shelter before the deep winter settles in. The first structure is a communal house, a place of gathering, protection, and shared warmth. Imagine the sound of axes chopping into frozen wood, the quiet grunts of effort, the smell of pine and smoke. Days are short, and hands are numb, but the need for survival sharpens every task. They build with what they have, fallen timber, salvaged planks from the Mayflower, and the sheer will to live. The men and boys venture into the woods to cut down trees, while the women and girls tend to the sick and prepare what little food remains. But the first winter is unforgiving. One by one, sickness spreads. Coughs echo in the still air. Fevers burn behind shivering brows. And food becomes scarce. There are no gardens yet, no livestock, only what can be fished or foraged. Each morning brings the toll of loss. By spring, nearly half of the original 102 settlers will have died. Yet in the midst of grief, a quiet resilience takes root. By March, something unexpected happens. A tall native man walks into the clearing. His name is Samoset. He speaks a few words of English, enough to greet the settlers and ask for food and shelter. The pilgrims, astonished and wary, listen carefully. He promises to return with someone who can speak their language more fluently. And so he does. Days later, Squanto arrives, an extraordinary man who had been captured years earlier, taken to Europe, and later returned to his homeland, only to find his tribe decimated by disease. He speaks English with ease and becomes a bridge between the pilgrims and the land that surrounds them. Squanto teaches them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. He shows them where to hunt and how to gather wild herbs. More importantly, he introduces them to Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy. A treaty is formed, a peace agreement promising mutual protection and friendship. Imagine that moment. Two groups, once strangers, now sitting across from one another. There is caution, yes, but also a thread of possibility, of peace stitched across language and culture. It is quiet, respectful. The treaty will last for more than 50 years. As the weather warms, the colony begins to bloom. Fields of corn rise from the soil. Small homes are built, modest and wooden, with thatched roofs and stone chimneys. A meeting house stands at the center, where prayers echo each morning and evening. The settlers organize themselves with diligence. Each family receives land to farm, and decisions are made collectively, often with spiritual guidance. They name their settlement Plymouth, after the port they left behind in England. The name carries memory and longing, but now also hope. Daily life is still difficult. There are tools to be shared, injuries to be tended, and disputes to settle. But slowly, rhythm returns, like a gentle tide. Children play along the shore. Women gather herbs in the woods. Men mend fences and plows. And at night, beneath lantern light, they sing hymns of gratitude. In the fall of 1621, after a successful harvest, the colonists decide to hold a feast of Thanksgiving. They invite the Wampanoag as a gesture of friendship. 90 native men come, bringing deer and wild fowl. The colonists contribute vegetables, berries, and bread. For 3 days, they eat together, play games, and share stories. This was not a national holiday yet, only a quiet gathering of people who had survived. But in their laughter and prayers, we feel the echo of what would become a lasting tradition. Through this first year, the colony's foundations are laid, not just in timber and stone, but in mutual support, in shared loss, in the willingness to learn, adapt, and trust. Plymouth Colony does not become a city overnight. It remains small, vulnerable, and often uncertain. But it is alive. And with each passing season, it grows a little stronger. By the end of the second year, new settlers begin to arrive. Some are family members of those already there. Others are strangers seeking the same religious freedom. Governance develops too. The Pilgrims gather in town meetings, elect leaders, and write simple laws based on the compact they had signed aboard the Mayflower. They learn to resolve disputes through discussion rather than force. They believe in service to the community, in responsibility to one another. Let your mind settle on the image of Plymouth in its early days. Simple homes tucked between hills and ocean, smoke rising gently from chimneys, the sound of hymns carried on the wind. Chickens scratching in the dirt. Corn swaying in neat rows. Children chasing each other between tree stumps. It is peaceful. It is quiet. In this place, the roots of a nation are slowly taking hold, not through conquest or wealth, but through community and cooperation. The Pilgrims were not perfect, and their journey was far from easy. But in the silence of the forest and the flickering of their lanterns, they dreamed of something greater. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of those small cabins under a canopy of stars. The whisper of prayers behind wooden walls. The slow, patient work of building something new. Plymouth was more than a place. It was an idea, a humble beginning to a story still unfolding. The first Thanksgiving. As autumn paints the landscape with shades of amber and gold, the year of hardship and hope at Plymouth Colony draws to a close. It is the fall of 1621, a season of plenty and gratitude, when the settlers gather to celebrate what we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. The harvest has been bountiful, thanks to the teachings of Squanto and the support of the Wampanoag people. The Pilgrims managed to grow enough crops to sustain themselves through the cold months ahead. Cornfields ripple gently in the breeze. Pumpkins and squash rest in the storerooms, and the sounds of wildlife echo softly in the crisp air. This feast is not just about food. It is a gathering of survival, friendship, and faith. The Pilgrims invite their Native American neighbors, Chief Massasoit and 90 of his men, to join them in a 3-day celebration. Imagine the mingling of languages and laughter, the exchange of stories around crackling fires, and the sharing of hunting tales and prayers. Together, they feast on venison, wild fowl, fish, corn, beans, and squash, a simple yet meaningful meal. Games and contests fill the days, and the air is thick with a sense of hope. For the Pilgrims, this is more than a harvest festival. It is a testament to resilience, a moment to honor the land and those who helped them endure. The first Thanksgiving sets a quiet precedent, a tradition of gratitude that echoes through the centuries. Though the meaning and observance of Thanksgiving have evolved, the origins remain rooted in this peaceful gathering of two peoples, sharing food and friendship amid the vast wilderness. As you close your eyes tonight, let the gentle warmth of that autumn feast soothe you. Picture the flickering flames, the soft murmur of voices, and the calm acceptance of a new life built on cooperation and hope. Drift slowly into rest with the comforting thought that even in the hardest times, there can be moments of light, connection, and gratitude. The Age of Discovery. In the quiet depths of history, long before the United States emerged as a nation, there was a time when the world seemed much larger and much more mysterious. This was the Age of Discovery, a period stretching roughly from the early 15th century into the early 17th century, when European explorers set out on daring voyages across unknown seas, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the desire for new trade routes. Imagine the vastness of the oceans, dark and endless, with no maps to guide them and no certainty of what lay beyond the horizon. For centuries, Europeans knew only of their own continent, and tales of distant lands were filled with wonder and sometimes fear. Yet, the call to explore was strong, fueled by the hope of finding wealth, spreading religion, and gaining power. This age was sparked in part by the innovations of navigation and shipbuilding. The development of the caravel, a small, fast ship with triangular sails, allowed sailors to venture further than ever before. Instruments like the compass and the astrolabe helped navigators find their way by the stars. With these tools, explorers braved the seas, mapping coastlines and discovering islands. Portugal and Spain were the early leaders of this new age. Portuguese explorers sailed down the coast of Africa, gradually pushing their way around the continent's southern tip, hoping to find a sea route to the riches of Asia. Their voyages opened paths for trade in spices, gold, and other treasures. Spain, motivated by similar ambitions, sponsored voyages across the Atlantic Ocean. The most famous of these was Christopher Columbus's journey in 1492, which, although intended to reach Asia, instead led him to the islands of the Caribbean. This event marked the beginning of sustained European contact with the Americas, forever changing the course of history. The Age of Discovery was not only about exploration, it was also a time of great cultural exchanges. Europeans encountered new peoples, plants, and animals that were entirely unknown to them. At the same time, their arrival introduced foreign goods and ideas to the native populations. Yet, this age was complex and often harsh. The quest for wealth and land sometimes led to conflict, exploitation, and suffering for many indigenous peoples. But it also set the stage for the future growth of colonies and nations, including the United States. As you let these thoughts settle softly, imagine the creaking ships cutting through the waves, the endless skies above, and the brave souls who looked beyond their known world. Their voyages opened doors to new chapters in history, chapters of discovery, challenge, and change. Let this calm reflection gently carry you toward rest, with the knowledge that even the greatest journeys begin with a single step into the unknown. Columbus and the Caribbean. As the gentle waves ripple beneath a calm sky, we turn our attention to one of the most famous voyages of the Age of Discovery, that of Christopher Columbus. In 1492, Columbus, an Italian navigator sailing under the Spanish flag, embarked on a journey that would forever alter the course of history. His goal was ambitious, to find a westward sea route to Asia, rich in spices and precious goods. At that time, the lands beyond Europe were largely unknown to the Western world, and many believed the ocean was vast and perilous. Yet, with 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, Columbus set sail into the unknown, guided by hope and determination. After weeks at sea, Columbus and his crew spotted land on October 12, 1492. They had reached islands in what we now call the Caribbean. Columbus believed he had found islands off the coast of Asia, unaware that this was an entirely new continent, home to diverse peoples and cultures. The islands Columbus encountered were inhabited by the Taino people, who lived in villages and cultivated crops like cassava, sweet potatoes, and maize. The initial meetings between Columbus's crew and the Taino were marked by curiosity and cautious exchange. Columbus described the natives as friendly and generous, and his reports back to Spain painted the Caribbean as a land of opportunity. However, the arrival of Europeans brought profound change and challenge. Over the following years, Spanish expeditions established settlements and claimed the islands for Spain. The Taino population suffered greatly due to diseases brought by Europeans, against which they had no immunity, and due to harsh labor demands. Despite these hardships, the Caribbean became a crucial foothold for European powers. It served as a launching point for further explorations into the mainland of the Americas, setting the stage for the vast and complex history that would unfold. As you imagine the calm Caribbean breeze and the gentle lapping of the sea, picture the quiet lives of the islanders and the distant sails on the horizon. Reflect on the mingling of worlds, the old and the new, and let the soft waves of history lull you toward a peaceful rest. Spanish conquistadors in North America. In the vast and untamed lands of North America, the footsteps of the Spanish conquistadors left an indelible mark during the early years of European exploration. Following the initial contact in the Caribbean, Spanish explorers and soldiers ventured inland, driven by the promise of gold, glory, and new territories. Imagine the rugged landscapes, vast deserts, towering mountains, and dense forests, waiting to be explored. The conquistadors, equipped with armor, swords, and a determination fueled by ambition and faith, moved through these unfamiliar regions. Among the most famous was Hernán Cortés, whose expedition led to the conquest of the mighty Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico. The Aztecs, a sophisticated civilization with impressive cities, temples, and a rich culture, met the Spanish with a mix of awe and resistance. The encounters were complex, involving alliances with some native groups, fierce battles, and tragic consequences. The Spanish brought new weapons, horses, and diseases that dramatically altered the balance of power. Beyond Mexico, explorers like Francisco Vázquez de Coronado journeyed into what is now the southwestern United States, searching for legendary cities of gold. Though the fabled riches were never found, these expeditions mapped vast areas and established Spanish claims. The conquistadors also spread Christianity, building missions and churches as part of their efforts to convert native populations. These missions became centers of culture and religion, influencing the development of many regions. However, the arrival of the Spanish came with hardship for many indigenous peoples. Forced labor, disease, and cultural disruption took a heavy toll. Yet, the blending of Spanish and native cultures over time also created new communities and traditions that endure to this day. As you listen to the quiet stories of these early explorers, picture the sun setting over expansive deserts and ancient cities, the soft sound of distant footsteps, and the mingling of two worlds. Let these reflections ease your mind and guide you gently toward rest. French exploration of the interior. As the gentle rivers meander through vast forests and rolling plains, the story of French exploration in North America quietly unfolds. Unlike the Spanish, whose focus was often on conquest and settlement along coasts and fertile valleys, the French were drawn deeper into the continent's interior, seeking trade, especially in valuable furs, and alliances with Native American peoples. The early 17th century saw French explorers such as Samuel de Champlain venture into what would later be called Canada. Champlain, often called the father of New France, established Quebec in 1608, creating a base for French presence in the New World. From here, French voyagers navigated vast river systems like the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi, opening pathways through dense forests and across serene lakes. The French approach to exploration was notably different. They often formed cooperative relationships with native tribes, trading goods such as beads, cloth, and metal tools for furs. These partnerships were built on mutual benefit and respect, with French explorers frequently learning native languages and customs. The fur trade became the heart of French colonial economy. Trappers and traders ventured into wilderness areas, following the migration routes of beavers and other fur-bearing animals. Their journeys helped map vast territories that were previously unknown to Europeans. French missionaries, particularly Jesuits, traveled alongside explorers to spread Christianity. They established missions and schools, contributing to cultural exchanges and sometimes tensions between indigenous beliefs and European religion. The French presence extended down the Mississippi River, exploring and claiming lands far into the interior of the continent. This created a network of settlements and trading posts that would influence the region's future. As you imagine the quiet forests and flowing rivers, picture the canoes gliding silently beneath the trees and the soft voices of traders and natives exchanging stories and goods. Let the peaceful rhythm of this exploration soothe your mind, inviting calm and rest as the story gently unfolds. British settlements begin. In the early 17th century, the British began their own chapter of exploration and settlement along the eastern shores of North America. Unlike the Spanish and French, whose efforts were concentrated on conquest and trade, the British approach often involved establishing permanent colonies, places where families could live, work, and build new communities. Imagine the dense forests and sprawling coastlines of the Atlantic seaboard, where English ships arrived carrying hopeful settlers. One of the first successful English settlements was Jamestown, founded in 1607 in what is now Virginia. This marked the beginning of England's lasting presence in the New World. The settlers faced many hardships, unfamiliar lands, harsh winters, and sometimes difficult relations with the native populations. Yet, they persevered, cultivating crops such as tobacco, which would become a vital economic resource. Alongside Jamestown, the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 on the Mayflower, seeking religious freedom. They established Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, laying foundations for communities based on shared beliefs and self-governance. Their story of struggle and cooperation with local Native American tribes is remembered as a significant moment in early American history. Over time, other British colonies took shape along the coast, from New England down to the Carolinas. Each had its own character, influenced by the settlers' origins, economic pursuits, and interactions with indigenous peoples. The British colonies developed systems of government and law, drawing from English traditions but adapting to new circumstances. Town meetings, elected assemblies, and local courts became part of colonial life, fostering a sense of order and community. As you picture the wooden houses, winding roads, and quiet harbors of these early settlements, imagine the hopes and challenges of those first colonists. Let the peaceful images of dawn breaking over forested hills and the gentle sounds of a new day fill your mind, guiding you softly toward rest. Dutch and Swedish colonies. Along the mid-Atlantic coast of North America, another chapter of early colonial history quietly took shape with the establishment of Dutch and Swedish settlements. While smaller in scale compared to the British and French, these colonies contributed unique cultural and economic threads to the growing tapestry of what would become the United States. The Dutch founded New Netherland in the early 17th century, with its capital at New Amsterdam, located on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. This bustling trading hub attracted settlers from various European countries, creating a diverse community marked by tolerance and commerce. The Dutch West India Company controlled the colony, focusing on trade, especially in fur, with native tribes. New Amsterdam's strategic location made it a center of maritime activity. Ships arrived from Europe bringing goods, people, and ideas, while merchants traded with Native Americans and other colonies. Streets filled with the sounds of multiple languages, horses clopping over cobblestones, and the hum of markets. At the same time, Swedish settlers established the colony of New Sweden along the Delaware River in the 1630s. Though small, this colony introduced important elements such as log cabin construction, which would influence frontier architecture in America. The relationships between these colonies and indigenous peoples varied. While trade and occasional alliances flourished, tensions and conflicts also occurred. Despite this, the Dutch and Swedish presence added to the cultural diversity of the region. Eventually, in 1664, the English took control of New Netherland, renaming New Amsterdam as New York. This marked the beginning of British dominance along the eastern seaboard but did not erase the influences left by the Dutch and Swedes. As you imagine the cobbled streets of New Amsterdam, the sailboats on the Hudson River, and the peaceful forests along the Delaware, picture a blend of cultures and communities weaving quietly together. Let the gentle rhythm of this story calm your mind as you drift toward restful sleep. The Columbian Exchange. The story of the Columbian Exchange is a gentle but profound tale of how two worlds, Europe and the Americas, became connected in a way that forever changed the course of history. This exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, was not just about goods or people, but about plants, animals, culture, and even ideas flowing back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Before this exchange, the Americas had a unique ecosystem, with crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes flourishing in the soil. Meanwhile, Europe, Africa, and Asia had their own distinct plants and animals. When explorers and settlers arrived, they carried with them seeds, livestock, and knowledge, and in turn, brought back the treasures of the New World. Imagine the journey of the potato, a humble root vegetable native to the Andes Mountains, traveling across the ocean to Europe, where it became a staple food for millions. Similarly, tomatoes, once unknown outside the Americas, became central to Mediterranean cuisine. On the other hand, horses, cattle, and sheep were introduced to the Americas, transforming native ways of life. Horses gave many indigenous peoples increased mobility, changing hunting and warfare patterns. Cattle and sheep provided new sources of food, clothing, and labor. However, this exchange also had darker consequences. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza traveled with Europeans and devastated native populations who had no immunity. Entire communities were affected, altering the demographic and cultural landscape. The Columbian Exchange was not a single event but an ongoing process that shaped agriculture, diets, economies, and societies on both sides of the ocean. It laid the foundations for the interconnected world we know today. As you picture the slow drift of ships crossing the vast blue ocean, laden with goods and hope, imagine the quiet planting of seeds in new soils and the soft sounds of animals settling into unfamiliar pastures. Let this story of connection and change gently ease you into peaceful rest. Impact on native populations. The arrival of European explorers and settlers marked a profound and often tragic turning point for the native peoples of North America. As the continent opened to new influences, the indigenous populations faced changes that would reshape their lives forever. Before European contact, native societies were diverse, with rich cultures, languages, and ways of life deeply connected to the land. The arrival of Europeans brought new technologies, trade goods, and ideas, but also disease, displacement, and conflict. One of the most devastating impacts was the spread of diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native peoples had no natural immunity to these illnesses, leading to widespread epidemics that reduced populations dramatically. Entire villages sometimes disappeared, and the social fabric of many tribes was strained or broken. Beyond disease, the arrival of settlers often meant the loss of land. Colonists claimed territories for farming, settlement, and resource extraction, pushing native communities into smaller and often less fertile areas. This displacement disrupted traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering practices. Relationships between natives and Europeans varied widely. Some tribes formed alliances and engaged in trade, exchanging furs and other goods for European items like metal tools and firearms. These partnerships sometimes brought benefits but could also lead to dependency and loss of autonomy. Conflicts erupted as competition for land and resources increased. Wars and skirmishes occurred throughout the colonial period, shaping the geopolitical landscape of the continent. Despite these challenges, native cultures showed resilience. Traditions, languages, and knowledge passed down through generations persisted and adapted in new circumstances. As you imagine the quiet forests, vast plains, and flowing rivers where native peoples lived, picture the resilience and spirit that endured through change. Let the calm rhythm of nature and the soft stories of these communities soothe your mind, guiding you toward peaceful sleep. The development of infrastructure like roads and ports facilitated commerce and communication between the colonies and the wider world. Markets and fairs became gathering places for farmers, merchants, and artisans, fostering community connections. The economy was not without its challenges. Periodic conflicts with Native Americans, harsh winters, and limited labor forces tested the colony's ability to grow. Yet, the diversity of economic activities allowed the colonies to adapt and prosper. As you imagine the quiet rhythm of the fields, the gentle creak of ship masts in harbor, and the steady work of craftsmen shaping wood and metal, let the soothing sounds of colonial life ease you into restful sleep. Slavery in the colonies. The institution of slavery became a dark and enduring part of the economic and social fabric of the American colonies. From the early 1600s, enslaved Africans were brought to the New World, fundamentally shaping the colony's development in ways both profound and tragic. Slavery in the colonies began with the arrival of the first Africans in Virginia in 1619. Initially, the status of these Africans was somewhat ambiguous, as some may have been treated as indentured servants, working for a set period in exchange for freedom. However, as time passed, laws hardened to create a system of lifelong, hereditary enslavement based on race. The southern colonies, with their plantation economies growing labor-intensive crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo, relied heavily on enslaved labor. The scale and brutality of slavery were immense. Enslaved people faced harsh working conditions, loss of freedom, and cruel treatment. Families were often separated, and basic human rights were denied. In contrast, slavery in the northern and middle colonies was smaller in scale but still significant. Enslaved Africans worked as domestic servants, artisans, dock workers, and laborists. Although the economy in these regions was less dependent on slavery, the institution was embedded in the social and economic systems. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific network that forcibly transported millions of Africans across the ocean in brutal conditions. Ships were overcrowded, diseases spread rapidly, and mortality rates were high. This journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a grim beginning for those enslaved. Resistance to slavery took many forms, from subtle acts of defiance to open revolts. Enslaved people preserved cultural traditions, languages, and faiths as acts of resilience. Some escaped to freedom or formed maroon communities. The morality of slavery was a subject of debate even during colonial times. Religious groups such as the Quakers began to speak out against the practice, sowing seeds for future abolitionist movements. Slavery's legacy would deeply influence American history, economics, and race relations, with consequences that are still felt today. Imagine the quiet sorrow behind closed doors, the whispered hopes of freedom, and the courage it took to survive under such harsh conditions. Let these somber reflections lull you gently into rest. Native relations and conflict. The relationship between the 13 colonies and the Native American peoples was complex, marked by periods of cooperation, trade, cultural exchange, but also by conflict, displacement, and profound tragedy. Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes had lived for thousands of years across the land, each with rich cultures, languages, and social structures adapted to their environments. When Europeans came, their arrival triggered dramatic changes. Early interactions often began peacefully. Colonists and native peoples engaged in trade, exchanging goods such as furs, tools, and food. Native knowledge of the land, plants, and survival techniques proved invaluable to settlers unfamiliar with the New World. However, as more Europeans arrived and settlements expanded, competition for land increased. Colonists viewed land as a commodity to own and cultivate, while many native cultures had a more communal and spiritual relationship with the land. This fundamental difference contributed to misunderstandings and tensions. Several wars and violent clashes erupted throughout the colonial period. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, was one of the deadliest conflicts between Native Americans and English settlers, devastating many communities. Similarly, the Powhatan Wars in Virginia reflected deep-rooted struggles over territory. Disease also played a tragic role, as European illnesses like smallpox spread among native populations, who had no immunity. This caused dramatic population declines and weakened resistance to colonization. Some colonies adopted policies of alliance and coexistence, often through treaties and intermarriage, but these agreements were frequently broken or manipulated to benefit settlers. The gradual push westward pushed native peoples off their ancestral lands. Displacement and cultural disruption had lasting impacts on Native American societies. As you reflect on the quiet forests where these early interactions unfolded, the echoes of both friendship and sorrow, let your mind drift gently toward peaceful rest. The growth of self-government. From the earliest days, the American colonies began to develop systems of self-government that laid the groundwork for democratic ideals and practices later embodied in the United States Constitution. These early forms of governance reflected a desire among colonists for local control and participatory decision-making. One of the first examples was the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619. This assembly was the first elected legislative body in the English colonies, giving settlers a voice in local affairs. Though limited to land-owning men, it marked a significant step toward representative government. In New England, the Mayflower Compact of 1620 represented an early social contract. The Pilgrims agreed to form a civil body politic to make laws for the good of the colony. Town meetings became a common practice, where male citizens gathered to discuss and decide community matters, reinforcing direct democracy. As colonies grew, charters and constitutions codified governmental structures. These documents often granted colonists rights to elect assemblies, create laws, and manage taxation. Colonists learned to balance authority between governors appointed by the crown and elected representatives. Streets like a live wire. By 1773, the American colonies were no longer simmering with discontent. They were beginning to boil over. The latest spark came in the form of a seemingly simple commodity, tea. For the British government, tea was more than just a beverage. It was an economic lifeline, particularly for the struggling British East India Company, which had accumulated unsold mountains of tea in its warehouses. To save it, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. This law allowed the East India Company to sell its surplus tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price, cheaper even than smuggled Dutch tea. But there was a catch: the tea would still carry a small tax. The price may have been lower, but accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies. To the British, this seemed reasonable. To the colonists, it was a trap. The principle remained unchanged: no taxation without representation. The lower cost didn't matter. What mattered was that this was yet another attempt to assert control without consent. Across the colonies, merchants, smugglers, and patriots alike saw through the maneuver and rallied against it. Ships carrying the taxed tea were turned away in Philadelphia and New York. In Charleston, the tea was quietly unloaded and left to rot in storage. But in Boston, things took a more dramatic turn. As winter approached, 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sat anchored in Boston Harbor, their hulls heavy with crates of tea. Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a loyalist, refused to allow the ships to leave without unloading. The deadline approached. If the tea wasn't removed, it would be seized and taxed. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a meeting of over 5,000 colonists gathered at the Old South Meeting House. Voices rang out in the candlelit hall, debating the fate of the tea. As the night deepened, a decision was made, not by vote, but by action. A group of men, many disguised in Mohawk warrior attire, marched silently through the streets. Some were members of the Sons of Liberty, others simply citizens fueled by a sense of injustice. They boarded the ships without violence or theft. Only one mission drove them forward. Crate by crate, they hoisted the chests of tea onto the decks and split them open with axes. Over 340 chests, holding more than 90,000 pounds of tea, were dumped into the icy harbor. The dark water swirled with leaves and foam. Not a single man was injured. Not a drop of liquor was consumed. They left the decks broom clean. By morning, news of the event, what would become known as the Boston Tea Party, spread like wildfire. To many colonists, it was a bold stand against tyranny. To the British, it was an outrageous act of defiance that could not go unanswered. Parliament responded swiftly and harshly with the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and sent more British troops to enforce order. Rather than silence dissent, the punishment unified the colonies. Towns sent aid to Boston. Delegates from across the colonies began to talk of cooperation, resistance, and rights. What began as a protest over a tax on tea had awakened something far greater: a collective identity and shared purpose. As you sink into stillness now, imagine the cold salt breeze of Boston Harbor on that December night, the creak of ship timbers underfoot, and the whispered resolve of a people who had decided they would no longer be ruled without a voice. The Boston Tea Party was not just a protest. It was a declaration, unspoken but unmistakable. Liberty was worth the risk, worth the storm, worth the plunge into dark waters. First Continental Congress. The streets of Philadelphia in the autumn of 1774 were filled with the crisp scent of fallen leaves and whispers of revolution. Within the brick walls of Carpenter's Hall, a quiet but monumental gathering was underway. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies had arrived, summoned not by a king, but by a shared sense of urgency. They called it the First Continental Congress. The trigger had been the Intolerable Acts, Britain's harsh response to the Boston Tea Party. These laws had not only punished Boston but had shown all colonies just how far Parliament was willing to go to assert its control. It wasn't just about Massachusetts anymore. It was about every colony's future. On September 5, 1774, 56 men gathered in Philadelphia. They were not wild-eyed rebels. Many were lawyers, planters, merchants, men of reason, education, and caution. Among them stood George Washington, the tall and quiet Virginian, John Adams, the sharp-witted lawyer from Massachusetts, Patrick Henry, the firebrand orator, and Samuel Adams, the seasoned revolutionary. The only absent colony was Georgia, still embroiled in conflict with local native tribes and dependent on British support. They did not arrive as Americans. They came as Virginians, New Yorkers, South Carolinians, each with loyalty to their home colony. But that was about to change. Inside the hall, debate raged. How should they respond to Britain's growing oppression? Some wanted to reconcile. Others demanded firm resistance. There were questions of loyalty, law, and liberty. And all the while, the heavy shadow of war loomed just outside the chamber. The delegates agreed on several key actions. First, they issued a bold declaration. The rights of Englishmen did not vanish upon crossing the Atlantic. Colonists were entitled to life, liberty, and property. Parliament, they argued, had no right to tax them without their consent. Then, in a striking move, they formed a boycott of British goods, known as the Continental Association. Colonists would cease importing or using British products until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. Local communities were urged to form committees of inspection to enforce the boycott, a quiet preparation for more organized resistance. Perhaps most importantly, they agreed to reconvene if Britain refused to respond. This was no one-time meeting. It was the beginning of a new political structure that would carry the colonies toward independence. In private letters, some delegates expressed awe at what was happening. A roomful of men from scattered lands, many of whom had never met before, had come together to speak as one. They didn't always agree, but they listened. They argued. And in doing so, they created something new, the beginning of a unified American identity. When the Congress adjourned in late October, the delegates returned home not as isolated colonists, but as representatives of a broader cause. They carried resolutions, plans, and a renewed sense of purpose. The First Continental Congress was not a call to war. Not yet. But it was a statement, a declaration that the colonies would no longer sit silently as their liberties were stripped away. It was a flicker of unity in the dark, a gathering of voices that would soon roar. As you let your thoughts settle now, picture the quiet confidence of that room. Quills scratching parchment, the murmur of careful words, the weight of history taking shape. In the calm before the storm, these men chose dialogue over silence, resistance over surrender. And though they could not know it yet, they had taken the first true step toward building a new nation. In 1835, tensions boiled over into open conflict, beginning what would become the Texas Revolution. Battles erupted across the territory, with early fighting taking place at places like Gonzales, where settlers famously resisted Mexican troops who sought to seize a cannon. The most iconic event of the revolution was the Battle of the Alamo in early 1836. A small group of Texan defenders, including famous figures like James Bowie, William B. Travis, and Davy Crockett, held out against the vastly larger Mexican army for 13 days. Though the Alamo fell, the defenders' courage became a powerful symbol of resistance and inspired more settlers to join the fight for independence. Soon after, the Texas Army, led by Sam Houston, won a decisive victory at the Battle of San Jacinto. In April 1836, Houston's forces surprised Santa Anna's army and forced him to surrender, securing Texas's independence. The Republic of Texas was born, but its future was uncertain. It remained an independent nation for nearly a decade, seeking recognition and protection from other countries, including the United States. The Texas Revolution had far-reaching consequences. It heightened tensions between the United States and Mexico, contributing directly to the Mexican-American War later in the decade. It also intensified debates within the U.S. over slavery, as Texas entered as a slaveholding republic. For the settlers who fought, the revolution was about more than land. It was about identity, freedom, and the right to govern themselves. The Texas Revolution stands as a testament to the complex, often turbulent history of American expansion and the blending of cultures on the frontier. Annexation of Texas. The annexation of Texas into the United States was a momentous event that significantly shaped the nation's expansionist trajectory and intensified sectional tensions leading up to the Civil War. It marked the formal incorporation of the Republic of Texas as the 28th state of the United States, but the journey to annexation was anything but straightforward. Following its victory in the Texas Revolution in 1836, Texas existed as an independent republic. Though it sought recognition and protection, its status was precarious. The young nation faced constant threats from Mexico, which never fully accepted Texas's independence and viewed the territory as a rebellious province. The Republic of Texas eagerly pursued annexation by the United States, believing it would provide security and economic stability. However, the idea of annexation stirred deep controversy within the U.S. The main issues were political and moral. Texas was a large territory that allowed slavery, and its admission threatened to upset the delicate balance between slave and free states in Congress. In addition, annexing Texas risked war with Mexico, which still claimed the land. Many politicians feared that annexation could trigger a bloody conflict and destabilize the region. President Andrew Jackson and later Martin Van Buren were hesitant, and despite multiple proposals, annexation efforts stalled. Public opinion in the U.S., however, increasingly favored annexation, driven by the popular belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to expand westward across the continent. Southerners particularly supported annexation because it promised to expand slaveholding territory and strengthen their political power. By the late 1840s, after the election of President James K. Polk, a firm supporter of manifest destiny, the political climate had shifted. Polk and his administration were determined to expand the nation's borders, including bringing Texas into the Union. In 1845, Congress passed a joint resolution to annex Texas. This was a strategic move, as it required only a simple majority in both houses, rather than a treaty requiring a two-thirds Senate majority. Texas accepted the offer, and on December 29, 1845, it officially became the 28th state. The annexation instantly heightened tensions with Mexico. The Mexican government broke diplomatic relations with the U.S., claiming that the annexation was an act of aggression. The dispute over Texas's southern border, whether it was the Rio Grande or the Nueces River, became the spark for the Mexican-American War. Beyond international conflict, annexation exacerbated the sectional divide in the U.S. The admission of Texas as a slave state ignited fierce debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories. These debates were a major factor leading toward the sectional conflicts that would erupt into the Civil War less than 2 decades later. For Texas, annexation brought economic growth and greater security, but it also meant navigating the challenges of statehood, including integrating into the U.S. political system and dealing with conflicts involving Native American tribes and settlers. In sum, the annexation of Texas was a crucial milestone in America's westward expansion, representing the intertwining of ambition, conflict, and ideology. It set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the continent and define the nation's future. The Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War, fought from 1846 to 1848, was a pivotal conflict that drastically reshaped the territorial boundaries of the United States and set the stage for future tensions within the young nation. Rooted in disputes over the annexation of Texas and border disagreements, this war marked the first major armed conflict fought on foreign soil by the United States and was driven by the ideology of manifest destiny. After Texas was annexed in 1845, the question of its southern border became the spark that ignited the war. Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its border, but Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, some 150 miles further north. This disagreement created a disputed zone that neither side fully controlled. President James K. Polk, a fervent believer in expanding the United States across the continent, sent troops under General Zachary Taylor into this contested territory. When Mexican forces attacked American soldiers in this disputed area in April 1846, Polk used the incident to urge Congress to declare war, famously stating that American blood had been shed on American soil. The declaration passed amid mixed opinions. Some Americans supported the war enthusiastically, seeing it as a chance to fulfill manifest destiny, while others, including future President Abraham Lincoln, questioned its justification. The war quickly expanded beyond Texas. American forces launched multiple campaigns into Mexican territory, including California and New Mexico. Led by generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, U.S. troops won key battles such as the Battle of Buena Vista and the Siege of Veracruz. The capture of Mexico City in 1847 marked a decisive victory that forced Mexico to negotiate peace. This war was notable for its technological and logistical advancements, including the use of railroads and telegraphs, which facilitated the movement of troops and communication. Additionally, it was a proving ground for many officers who would later become famous in the Civil War, including Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, ended the war and had profound consequences. Mexico ceded a vast portion of its northern territory, now the American Southwest, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, in what is known as the Mexican Cession. The United States paid Mexico $15 million and assumed $3.25 million in debts owed by Mexico to American citizens. Yet, while a few miners found immense fortune, many more faced hardship, disappointment, and exhaustion. Mining was grueling and dangerous work, with risks including accidents, disease, and harsh living conditions. Over time, large mining companies replaced individual prospectors, using machinery to extract gold more efficiently. The gold rush also had a lasting cultural impact, symbolizing the American spirit of adventure, risk-taking, and opportunity. It helped build the myth of the West as a land of endless possibilities and shaped the nation's identity as a place where anyone could seek a better life. In summary, the California Gold Rush was a transformative event that not only enriched the nation materially but also accelerated its expansion and development. It brought diverse peoples together, introduced new challenges, and left an indelible mark on American history. The Homestead Act. The Homestead Act, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, was one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of American westward expansion. It was designed to encourage settlement and development of the vast public lands in the western United States by offering free land to settlers willing to live on and improve the land. Before the act, much of the Western Territory belonged to the federal government and was largely unsettled, except for Native American tribes and a few scattered settlers. The government wanted to populate these lands quickly, to establish American presence and to promote agriculture and economic growth. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres of land to any adult citizen or intended citizen who paid a small registration fee and agreed to live on the land, build a home, and farm it for at least 5 years. This offer was revolutionary. It opened up opportunities for thousands of people who otherwise could not afford land. Immigrants, freed slaves, women, and families looking for a fresh start. The act symbolized the American dream, owning your own piece of land and building a life through hard work and determination. The process was straightforward in theory but challenging in practice. Settlers, often called homesteaders, had to travel to remote and undeveloped areas. They faced harsh weather, isolation, and the immense task of turning raw wilderness into productive farmland. Building a home and clearing the land required backbreaking labor, often with little assistance or resources. Many homesteaders had to contend with droughts, floods, pests, and sometimes conflicts with Native American tribes who were being displaced from their ancestral lands. Despite the difficulties, the Homestead Act spurred a massive wave of migration and settlement across states like Nebraska, Kansas, Dakota Territory, and later Oklahoma and beyond. Towns and communities sprang up as settlers worked together to build schools, churches, and infrastructure. The act also had profound social and economic effects. It encouraged the growth of a middle class of independent farmers and helped establish a rural, agricultural society that became a backbone of the American economy. It fostered a spirit of self-reliance and community cooperation, values still associated with American pioneer life. However, the Homestead Act was not without its flaws and controversies. Many settlers received poor-quality land that was difficult to farm. Speculators and large corporations sometimes exploited loopholes to claim large tracts of land, undermining the Act's original intent. Additionally, the Act contributed to the further displacement and suffering of Native American populations, as settlers encroached on their territories. Over time, amendments and new laws adjusted the Homestead Act to address some of these issues. The program officially ended in 1976-1986 in Alaska, by which time millions of acres had been distributed and millions of settlers had benefited from its promise. In sum, the Homestead Act was a bold and transformative policy that shaped the American West and the nation's development. It stands as a testament to the ideals of opportunity and expansion that characterized the 19th century and continues to influence American cultural identity. The Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was one of the greatest engineering feats and transformative projects in American history. Completed in 1869, it connected the eastern United States with the Pacific coast, revolutionizing transportation, commerce, and the settlement of the western frontier. Before the railroad, crossing the continent was a long, difficult, and dangerous journey. Travelers faced months on wagon trails or risky sea voyages around South America or across the Isthmus of Panama. The railroad shortened this journey from months to just about a week, making travel and trade faster, safer, and more affordable. The idea of a transcontinental railroad had been discussed for decades, but it wasn't until after the Civil War that the government fully committed to building it. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 provided federal support and funding, granting land and loans to railroad companies willing to build the line. Two companies took on the challenge: the Central Pacific, starting in Sacramento, California, and the Union Pacific, beginning in Omaha, Nebraska. The two lines raced toward each other, laying thousands of miles of track across some of the toughest terrains imaginable: mountains, deserts, and plains. The Central Pacific had to carve a path through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains, a monumental task involving blasting tunnels through solid granite and battling harsh winters. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, pushed westward across the vast Great Plains, facing not only natural obstacles but also conflicts with Native American tribes defending their lands. Thousands of workers, many immigrants including a large number of Chinese laborists on the Central Pacific side, risked their lives to build the railroad. They worked long hours under dangerous conditions for low pay, often facing accidents, avalanches, and disease. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah, where the famous Golden Spike was driven to mark the completion of the line. This event symbolized a new era of unity and progress for the nation. The impact of the Transcontinental Railroad was profound. It opened up the West to rapid settlement and economic development. Towns and cities sprang up along the tracks, and goods like cattle, crops, and minerals could be transported quickly to markets across the country and overseas. It also facilitated the movement of people, allowing immigrants and settlers to travel west in search of new opportunities. However, the railroad also had significant consequences. It accelerated the displacement of Native American tribes, as settlers and railroads encroached on indigenous lands. The environmental landscape was altered dramatically, and the railroads themselves sometimes engaged in corrupt practices and exploitation. Despite these challenges, the Transcontinental Railroad helped shape the modern United States. It symbolized technological innovation, national ambition, and the relentless drive toward growth and expansion. Rise of the factory system. The Industrial Revolution dramatically transformed the United States in the 19th century, shifting the nation from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse. Central to this transformation was the rise of the factory system, which revolutionized how goods were produced. Before factories, most goods were handmade at home or in small workshops. Factories introduced mechanized production lines that allowed mass manufacturing on an unprecedented scale. Powered by steam engines and later electricity, factories could produce textiles, tools, and machinery much faster and cheaper than before. This shift led to a surge in urban growth, as people moved from rural areas to cities in search of factory jobs. Women and children also joined the workforce, though often facing harsh working conditions and low pay. Factories changed daily life, creating new social classes and economic opportunities, but also sparking debates about labor rights and working conditions. The rise of the factory system marked the beginning of modern industry in America, laying the foundation for the country's emergence as a global economic leader. The railroad boom. The railroad boom was one of the most transformative developments during America's Industrial Revolution. Railroads connected distant parts of the country like never before, fueling economic growth and territorial expansion. In the mid-1800s, the construction of thousands of miles of railroad tracks opened up vast regions for settlement, trade, and industry. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 marked a historic moment, linking the East Coast with the West Coast and dramatically reducing travel time from months to days. Railroads made it easier to move goods such as coal, steel, and agricultural products, which helped industries flourish. Towns sprang up along rail lines, becoming hubs of commerce and culture. However, the railroad boom also brought challenges. Building the railroads was dangerous work, especially for immigrant laborers who faced harsh conditions and discrimination. The expansion also led to conflicts with Native American tribes, whose lands were often taken or disrupted. Despite these difficulties, the railroad boom reshaped the American landscape, economy, and society, setting the stage for the country's rise as an industrial superpower. Urbanization and city life. As railroads and factories spread across the United States, cities grew rapidly. This process, known as urbanization, transformed quiet towns into bustling centers of activity. People moved from farms to cities in search of jobs, drawn by the promise of steady wages and new opportunities. By the late 1800s, major cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were booming. Skyscrapers began to rise, public transportation systems expanded, and the skyline was lit by electric lights. Streets were filled with vendors, carriages, and eventually automobiles. For many, the city symbolized progress and hope. Yet, city life was far from perfect. Overcrowding became a serious issue. Poor families often lived in cramped tenements with little ventilation, no indoor plumbing, and dangerous conditions. Sanitation was a major problem, leading to disease outbreaks and health concerns. Still, cities became melting pots of culture and innovation. Immigrants brought traditions, foods, and languages that enriched American life. Neighborhoods formed around shared backgrounds, and community bonds grew strong. Urbanization created both challenges and possibilities, shaping the identity of modern America. Labor unions and strikes. As factories expanded during the Industrial Revolution, working conditions often worsened. Laborers toiled long hours, sometimes 12 to 16 hours a day, under harsh, unsafe conditions for meager pay. Children worked alongside adults in dangerous environments, and there were no laws to protect workers' rights. In response, workers began to organize. Labor unions emerged to fight for fair wages, reasonable hours, and safer workplaces. One of the earliest and most influential was the Knights of Labor, followed later by the American Federation of Labor, AFL. These groups gave workers a collective voice and the power to negotiate with factory owners. Strikes became a common tool in the fight for labor rights. Workers would walk off the job, sometimes shutting down entire industries. Some strikes were successful, like the 1886 movement for the 8-hour workday. Others, like the violent Haymarket Affair and the Pullman strike, ended in tragedy. Despite resistance from business owners and the government, labor unions slowly helped change the workplace. Their efforts laid the foundation for future labor laws and protections that we take for granted today. These early struggles were a key part of building a fairer, more balanced society. The Great Waves of Immigration. Between the mid-1800s and early 1900s, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration. Millions of people arrived from across Europe, Italy, Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Russia, fleeing poverty, war, and persecution. Others came from Asia, particularly China and later Japan, seeking opportunity and a new life in America. These immigrants brought diverse languages, cultures, and religions, enriching American society but also facing intense challenges. Many settled in cities, taking jobs in factories, construction, or domestic work. Their hard labor fueled the growing economy, but they were often met with suspicion, discrimination, and low wages. Some Americans feared immigrants would take their jobs or change the cultural fabric of the country. Anti-immigrant sentiment led to harsh policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and strict quotas in the early 20th century. Still, the immigrants persevered, building communities, churches, schools, and businesses. Their contributions helped shape modern America. From cuisine to labor to the arts, the legacy of this immigration wave is seen throughout the nation. It was a time of struggle and hope, where millions chased the promise of the American dream, leaving behind everything to start anew. Ellis Island and Angel Island. Ellis Island, located in New York Harbor, became the busiest immigration station in the United States between 1892 and 1954. More than 12 million immigrants passed through its gates, each carrying dreams of a better life. Families waited in long lines for medical exams, legal interviews, and the hope of approval. For many, stepping onto Ellis Island marked their first breath of freedom in a new world. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, Angel Island in San Francisco Bay processed immigrants, primarily from Asia, starting in 1910. Unlike Ellis Island, Angel Island was often more restrictive and harsh. Asian immigrants, especially the Chinese, faced intense scrutiny and detainment. Some were held for weeks, even months, undergoing repetitive questioning designed to find inconsistencies and reasons for denial. These two islands symbolized the gatekeeping of America. Ellis Island represented opportunity, while Angel Island echoed exclusion and prejudice. Yet both places were pivotal in shaping the country's diverse population. Today, they stand as historic landmarks. The stories of hope, endurance, and heartbreak that passed through their walls remain central to the American immigration experience, a reminder of what it meant to seek a new beginning in the land of freedom. Globalization and America's role in the 21st century. In the 21st century, globalization has further transformed the United States and its place in the world. Advances in transportation and communication technologies have made the world more interconnected than ever before. America plays a pivotal role as a global economic powerhouse, military leader, and cultural influencer. The country's businesses compete and collaborate with partners worldwide, while its policies impact international trade, diplomacy, and security. However, globalization also brings challenges such as job outsourcing, economic inequality, and cultural tensions. Issues like climate change, terrorism, and pandemics highlight the need for international cooperation. America's ongoing influence continues to evolve as it balances national interests with global responsibilities, shaping a complex and dynamic role in the modern world. Technological advances and innovation. The dawn of the 21st century has seen America at the forefront of rapid technological advances and innovation that continue to reshape society. From the rise of the internet and smartphones to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and renewable energy, these developments have revolutionized how people live, work, and communicate. American companies like Apple, Google, and Tesla have become global leaders, driving progress and shaping new industries. Innovation in healthcare, transportation, and space exploration continues to expand possibilities. However, these advances also raise ethical questions and societal challenges, such as data privacy, automation-related job displacement, and digital divides. As technology rapidly evolves, the United States must navigate balancing progress with responsibility. Environmental awareness and climate change. In recent decades, the United States has seen growing environmental awareness and urgent calls to address climate change. The devastating effects of pollution, deforestation, and global warming have become impossible to ignore. From rising sea levels to extreme weather events, these challenges threaten communities and ecosystems nationwide. Efforts to promote renewable energy, reduce carbon emissions, and conserve natural resources are gaining momentum. Policies like the Clean Air Act and the Paris Agreement highlight commitments to environmental protection, though political debates continue over the best approaches. Grassroots movements and youth activism have played crucial roles in pushing for sustainability. As the climate crisis intensifies, America faces the critical task of balancing economic growth with ecological responsibility to protect the planet for future generations. Technological innovations in the 21st century. The 21st century has been marked by remarkable technological innovations that have transformed every aspect of American life. From the rapid expansion of the internet and mobile technology to advances in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and renewable energy, technology is reshaping the economy, communication, and daily living. The rise of social media has changed how people connect, share information, and engage with the world. Innovations in medicine and science continue